Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, we're going to try to unpack some of the complexities of global politics.
It's a big one.
It is a big one.
Yeah.
And to help us with that, we're looking at a 2024 book by a Chinese political scientist named Bao Gangsheng.
Oh, Gangsheng.
Yeah. And the book is called Evolution.
Catchy.
It
Yeah.
is. And I think, it's interesting is we talk a lot about, kind of Western thinkers and Western ideas about, political science and politics.
Sure.
And so I think getting kind of an outside perspective,
It's refreshing.
yeah, is really interesting. And in this book, Bao is really grappling with this idea of this new reality in Western politics.
Well, what does it mean? What's driving it?
Right.
Where is it going?
Yeah. Is this like a blip, or is this something that is really fundamental?
Yeah.
And it's going to have, kind of ripple effects for decades to come.
Right.
So to kind of start to unpack that, he takes us back to some of the basics in political thought. And that is these two traditions of idealism versus realism.
Right. The age-old question, is man good
Yeah.
or is man bad?
Are we cooperative or are we competitive?
Right.
Kind of at our core. And so he talks about how much of Western political thought, especially since World War II, has really leaned into this idealism.
Right. The idea that through institutions and through shared values, we can cooperate to create a better world.
Yeah.
Think about the UN. Think about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Right. That we can all kind of agree on some basic principles
Right.
about how we should treat each other, how states should interact with each other.
Exactly.
And it's a hopeful vision.
It is.
But, is it a realistic vision?
Well, that's where realism comes in.
Okay.
So this goes all the way back to thinkers like Machiavelli, Hobbes,
Yeah.
more modern thinkers like Carl Schmitt. But the idea is that ultimately power is what matters.
Yeah.
Self-interest is the driving force of politics. Conflict is kind of inevitable. And Carl Schmitt, he takes it even further. He says ultimately politics is about deciding who's friend and who's enemy.
Right. It's us versus them.
Exactly.
Okay. So we've got these two kind of, extremes.
Right.
Or maybe not extremes, but two ends of a spectrum.
Yeah.
So where do you fall, listener? Are you more of an idealist? Do you think we can all get along? Or are you a realist? And you think ultimately.
Yeah.
It's all about power and self-interest.
Right.
I have to say, I think I'm leaning more and more towards the realism camp these days,
Yeah.
especially after reading Bao.
Well, he has another way of framing this that I think is really helpful. He talks about soft politics versus hard politics.
Okay.
So the idea is, after World War II, the West has enjoyed this long period
That's soft
of
politics.
soft politics, exactly, characterized by, relatively low levels of conflict, a general respect for the rules of the game.
Right. So you can think about this like your local town council meeting. Right. Like there might be some disagreements about the budget.
Yeah.
Or, where to put the new stop sign.
Right.
But, generally speaking, people are there because they want to make the town a better place.
Right.
They're willing to compromise.
Right.
They're willing to kind of work within the system.
And that's soft politics.
Right. And then you have hard politics,
Right.
which is, when things start to break down.
Right. When society becomes deeply divided, compromise seems impossible.
Right.
And you start to get those friend versus enemy distinctions.
Yeah.
Really hardening.
Yeah. And it feels like maybe we're shifting.
Yeah. It feels like things are getting a little bit harder.
A little bit harder these days. And Bao doesn't hold back when it comes to talking about why he thinks that is.
No, he doesn't.
He points to a bunch of different factors. He talks about the geopolitical situation, particularly for Europe, being geographically surrounded by regions that are in turmoil.
Right. Think about Russia, Ukraine, the Middle East,
Yeah.
North Africa.
Right. And how hard it is to kind of maintain that soft politics approach when you've got all of that going on around you.
Right. It's like trying to build a sandcastle
Right.
in a hurricane.
Yeah. And then he adds on top of that economic anxieties,
Yeah.
which, we've been talking about this for decades.
Decades.
And, globalization has brought a lot of benefits.
Right.
But it's also led to job losses
Uh-huh.
in the West.
No.
A sense that, the system is rigged against ordinary people. And he cites some pretty startling statistics here. Did you know that between 1980 and 2014, the U.S. lost over 35% of its manufacturing jobs?
That's huge.
It's a lot of people
Yeah.
whose livelihoods have disappeared. And, often with very few options for retraining
Yeah.
or finding comparable work.
Right. And that kind of economic dislocation can really fuel resentment
Right.
and anger. and
Yeah.
make people more susceptible to these, simpler solutions, even if those solutions are unrealistic.
Right. And so on top of all of that, you've got this other huge factor
Yeah.
that he talks about, which is population change.
Yeah.
Demographics.
Demographics, right. He lays out some pretty striking statistics about demographic trends in the
Nice.
West, and even points out that by 2050, white Christians could become a minority in the U.S.
Now, it's important to be clear here.
Yeah.
This is not about judging any particular group.
Right.
It's about acknowledging that these kinds of demographic shifts
Yep.
can have a huge impact on political dynamics, cultural values, even national identity.
Yeah. It's like throwing a whole bunch of new ingredients into a pot of stew.
Right.
It's going to change the flavor.
It's going to change the flavor, whether you like it or not.
Whether you like it or not.
It's going to change the flavor. And that leads right into, I think, a really key debate that's been simmering for years, especially in countries that have experienced large waves of immigration, and that's the assimilation debate.
Yeah.
How much should newcomers be expected to adapt to the existing culture
Right.
versus how much should the host society embrace difference and diversity?
Right. It's a tough one.
It is.
In Bao, he definitely leans towards the assimilation side of things.
Okay.
He argues that a certain level of shared values
Yeah.
and a sense of common identity is really crucial for a society to function well.
I mean, it kind of makes sense. It's like, if you're joining a team,
Right.
you kind of have to learn the playbook.
Right. You need to be willing to work together.
Right. I mean, you can bring your own unique skills to the table,
Right.
but you got to be on the same page.
Right. Exactly. He's not saying that people have to completely abandon their cultural heritage or anything like that.
Yeah.
But he does believe that embracing the core principles of the host society, things like the rule of law, individual rights, and democratic values,
Right. Okay.
that those are really crucial.
So where does that leave us with this whole idea of populism that gets thrown around so much these days?
Well, Bao has a pretty interesting take on that, too.
Okay.
He argues that what we often label as populism is really just ordinary people embracing a more realistic view of their own interests.
Okay, so they're not necessarily being swayed by, like, charismatic leaders or these simplistic slogans.
Right.
It's more that they're reacting to, real changes and challenges in their lives.
Exactly. They see their jobs disappearing, they see their communities changing, and they feel like the elites in power are out of touch with their concerns.
Yeah, it's like that feeling you get when you're stuck in traffic
Right.
and the cars in the fast lane are just whizzing by.
Okay.
You know something's not right, but you feel powerless to change it.
Right.
And that sense of being ignored or left behind can be really powerful.
Absolutely.
I mean, it can motivate political change, for sure. Whether you call it populism or something else.
Right.
It makes me think about how sometimes the so-called experts or the people making decisions just seem to be living in a completely different world
Yeah.
than the rest of us.
Yeah. Bao is definitely critical of what he sees as the naivete of some Western elites, who he believes have become too detached from the concerns of everyday people.
So he's calling for a more what? Like pragmatic approach to politics.
Yeah.
One that's focused on solving real problems.
Right. Not just clinging to abstract theories.
Right. And this is where things get really interesting, because he argues that the West needs to develop a new understanding of what it means to defend itself in this new era of hard politics.
Okay.
Would defend itself against what?
He's not just talking about military threats,
Nope.
though he certainly doesn't dismiss those either. He's talking about defending Western values, culture, way of life from both internal and external threats.
Okay, so not like isolationism or building walls, but just being more assertive
Yeah.
about protecting what it stands for.
Exactly. He sees this as essential for preserving the West's own vitality and ensuring its continued role as a positive force in the world.
So a more confident,
Yeah.
a more self-assured West
Yeah.
that's willing to stand up for its principles even in the face of adversity.
And a reminder that the future of Western civilization isn't a guarantee. It's something that we have to actively shape and defend, not just for our own sake, but for the sake of future generations.
So if we're talking about the West defending itself, and we got to talk about Europe, right?
Of course.
They're literally on the front lines
Yeah.
of a lot of these challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. Bao spends a significant portion of his book analyzing the specific situation in Europe,
Okay.
which he sees as particularly precarious.
Right. And he keeps coming back to this idea that Europe is geographically surrounded by all these regions in turmoil,
Right.
which makes it very difficult to maintain that soft politics approach.
Right. Think about the challenges posed by Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, the Middle East, North Africa.
Right.
These are regions grappling with conflict, instability, mass migration,
Right.
all of which have a direct impact on Europe.
It's like trying to maintain this peaceful, well-ordered garden while a wildfire's raging next door.
Right.
And those sparks are bound to fly over the fence.
Yeah.
And you have to make some tough choices about how to protect what you've cultivated.
Right, without becoming callous, without abandoning your principles.
And that's precisely the dilemma that many European countries are facing right now.
Yeah.
They want to uphold their values
Yeah.
of compassion and inclusivity and human rights, but they're also facing these real concerns about security,
Right.
social cohesion, the impact of large-scale immigration.
Yeah, and Bao doesn't shy away from presenting some uncomfortable truths about how Europeans view this influx of migrants,
Right.
particularly from Muslim-majority countries. He cites surveys showing widespread anxiety, even fear,
Yeah.
about potential cultural clashes,
Yeah.
the erosion of traditional values.
And those anxieties, whether they're justified or not, I mean, they're having a real impact on the political landscape.
Absolutely.
Right. They're fueling the rise of these nationalist and anti-immigration parties, driving a wedge between political establishments and segments of the population who feel unheard, creating this climate of distrust and division.
It's a reminder that facts and figures only tell part of the story.
Right.
We have to understand the emotions, the deeply held beliefs, the sense of identity that people are grappling with to really make sense of these political shifts.
Right. And on top of all that, you've got this growing threat of terrorism, which Bao refers to as urban guerrilla warfare.
Yeah.
This is a pretty chilling part of the book where he describes how easy it is for small groups or even individuals to inflict significant damage and terror in these densely populated areas.
He points out that the nature of modern terrorism, with its emphasis on striking soft targets, using social media for propaganda, makes it incredibly difficult to defend against.
Right. It's like trying to secure this vast interconnected network
Yeah.
with countless vulnerabilities.
Exactly.
And this, of course, raises all sorts of ethical and political dilemmas,
Yeah.
right? How much freedom are we willing to sacrifice in the name of security?
Right.
How do we balance the need to protect ourselves from real threats without resorting to measures that undermine the very values that we're trying to defend?
It's a question that Western societies are grappling with right now.
Yep.
And there are no easy answers.
Bale argues that this is where that tension between idealism and realism becomes most acute.
Right.
Right. On the one hand, we have our ideals of open societies, individual liberties, the rule of law. But on the other hand, we're facing adversaries who don't play by those rules,
Right.
who exploit our freedoms,
Right.
and who are willing to use violence to achieve their aims.
He uses the example of Trump's travel ban,
Right.
which targeted citizens from several Muslim-majority countries. This policy, while highly controversial and legally challenged, was ultimately upheld by the Supreme Court.
Right.
It's a stark illustration of how these hard politics challenges are forcing Western democracies to confront some very difficult choices.
It sounds like what he's saying is that the West really needs like a reality check.
Yeah.
You know, it can't just cling to these ideals of soft politics when you know the world around it is getting a lot tougher.
That's a good way to put it. He's definitely advocating for a more pragmatic, less idealistic approach. I think he recognizes that not all cultures share the same commitment to democracy and human rights, and that the West has to be willing to take decisive action to protect its interests, even if it means making some tough choices.
So not abandoning those values altogether, but maybe being a bit more strategic about how they're applied in a world where not everyone is playing by the same rules.
Exactly.
And he even uses this phrase, talking about the West needing to defend itself in new ways.
Right.
That's pretty powerful.
It is.
It's a call for a more assertive, less apologetic approach to global affairs.
I think so.
It's definitely a bold statement, and it raises a ton of questions. But I have to admit, after everything we've discussed, it does make you think. If the world is shifting in this direction towards this hard politics reality,
Right.
what does that mean for the future? What does that mean for things like international cooperation and global stability?
Yeah. Those are the million-dollar questions, and there are no easy answers, but I think one of the most important takeaways from Bao's book is this idea that we can't afford to be complacent.
Right.
You know, we can't just assume that The relative peace and prosperity that we've enjoyed in the West for the past few decades is just going to continue automatically.
Right. It's not a given.
It's not a given. It's a wake-up call, a reminder that history doesn't end, that conflict and struggle are part of the human condition, and that we have to be prepared to defend the values and the institutions that we hold dear.
And that defense, as Bao sees it, I mean, it requires more than just military strength or economic power.
Right. It's about renewing, I think, our cultural and intellectual foundations, a recommitment to those core principles of individual liberty, limited government, personal responsibility. It's about building strong communities, resilient societies that can withstand these pressures of a changing world.
So it's not just about building walls and stockpiling weapons.
Right.
It's also about strengthening the fabric of our societies from the inside out.
Yeah, exactly. Recognizing that freedom is not free.
Right.
It requires constant vigilance, thoughtful engagement, a willingness to stand up for what you believe in, even when it's difficult.
Well, Bao's book is definitely a challenging read.
It is.
And he doesn't shy away from some uncomfortable truths, but it's also incredibly thought-provoking.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I think, hopeful.
I agree.
It's a reminder that we have agency, that we can shape the future. But we need to be clear-eyed about the challenges that we face.
Yeah.
And willing to have those tough conversations.
Right.
About how to address them.
And I think that's the beauty of these deep dives. They push us to engage with these complex ideas, to broaden our perspectives, to think critically about the world around us.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe by wrestling with these big questions, we can come up with some answers, or at least some better questions to ask.
But thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We hope you learned something new. And we'll see you next time.